De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 32, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, the media war against Zimbabwe, solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Zimbabwe, resisting colonialism, neocolonialism, capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy. We're going to talk all about Zimbabwe, why we as young revolutionary, socialist, communist, anti-imperialist, internationalists must defend and stand in solidarity with Zimbabwe, such an inspirational history and people resisting all of these systems of oppression. And joining us today is Comrade Obi Egbuna Jr., a revolutionary journalist and activist who serves as the U.S. correspondent to the Herald, Zimbabwe's national newspaper. Obi has also served as the external relations officer of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. He's written 3 children's plays about Zimbabwe and produced 3 albums of music. And check out Battle Cry for Cuba and Zimbabwe with M1 of Dead Prez. Amazing work. Obi has such an extensive revolutionary resume, serving the people, serving Zimbabwe, Cuba, Africa, and the working class internationally. How's it going, Comrade Obi?
Good, great. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight.
Most definitely. And before we start, I just want to give a shout out to Comrade Oni with the All African People's Revolutionary Party in New Mexico. She actually put me in contact with Comrade Obi and has done really great work. Just recently did a stream on their channel about Zimbabwe film screening of this great documentary that we're going to play from later on. So I just want to give Comrade Oni a shout out. She's been doing amazing work. And she's, in my opinion, one of the most principled and active revolutionaries out there doing work. Before we get into talking about Zimbabwe and the reason why we're talking about Zimbabwe, me and Comrade Obi were talking about this. And by the way, shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, to Deborah Rodriguez, to Radical Leftist Agenda, to Eli Ace, to James, to everybody watching and listening. The reason we're talking about Zimbabwe is within the left, in the first world in particular, Zimbabwe doesn't seem to get the same love, solidarity, and respect that a lot of other movements get. And this is a shame, honestly, because there's so much revolutionary history, revolutionary struggle that's still taking place in Zimbabwe today, developments against colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, that not a lot of people are familiar with. So we're hoping to introduce Zimbabwe to you today, to have conversations about why you should not only learn about and be in solidarity with Zimbabwe, but to actively get involved. And maybe Comrade Obi can get it, link you up with some of the solidarity work that he's been involved in. But why don't you start off by telling us about some of the work that you've done and that you've been involved with? Because I think it's important. One of the things we were joking about before we started the stream was that you hate hearing about when all the stuff was going on with Zimbabwe and after Mugabe's passing, all these random people came out the woodwork and started talking about Zimbabwe as if they had any connection to it. So tell us a little bit about the work that you've done and any other how people can get involved.
Oh well, yes. Once again, we thank my sister Oni for arranging this tonight, and we hope that what we share meets your satisfaction as the host and to your listeners. For us, it's an extension of those who came before us. As a matter of fact, we're here tonight on October 15th. So you know that this is the anniversary of the Black Power Salute in Mexico City by John Carlos and Tommy Smith. But because of the amputated narrative of the collective African experience, many people just show them with the Black Power symbol, as powerful as that was. But a lot of people don't have exposure to their demands. And one of their main demands, arguably their most militant and emphatic demand, was that Avery Brundage, the chairman of the International Olympic Committee, was removed from the chairmanship of the International Olympic Committee because of his support for apartheid in South Africa, Azania, and Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, which Zimbabwe used to be under settler colonialism, and Northern Rhodesia in Zimbabwe. So that was the reason they felt that he should be immediately removed. That was one of their demands. That was one of their battle cries, if you will. So we gain our inspiration from them. We gain our inspiration from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who in 1968 was part of a conference in Lusaka, Zambia, showing the parallels between segregation and apartheid. We do what we do because of Bob Marley, because we know that not only did he perform at Rufaro Stadium the night of independence, April 18th, 1980, but he financed the trip of his band and paid for their equipment to be flown in, because at that particular juncture, Zimbabwe had just become independent and they had not had complete control of the economy in the country. So that was they had to fly to Jamaica to ask Bob to come, because they had heard his song and they felt that his song, it was only befitting, only appropriate, only necessary that that song Zimbabwe was performed that night in front of the Zimbabwean people after their work. So those who came before us who did, it is said that one of the reasons that the great Mutulu Shakur is in prison, one of our prisoners at war, is because what they did, they were standing with the people of Zimbabwe. So the new African organizations supported the struggle in Zimbabwe, supported the armed struggle in Mozambique, supported the armed struggle in Angola. And that's very important for young people to know, because the narrative that's being force-fed on you, the struggle of Southern Africa, a region of 14 countries, is reduced to the autobiographies of Nelson and Winnie Mandela. So you know as much, your only exposure is to the African National Congress, and not even the African National Congress, but primarily Nelson and Winnie Mandela. So information about Frelimo in Mozambique, you may not know. MPLA in Angola, you may not know. SWAPO in Namibia, you may not know. You made a comment earlier about the leftist aspect of it. One of the paternalistic trends that took place in the 70s in particular was when the Soviet Union took it upon themselves to write a list of African liberation movements on the continent that they felt were the most authentic. And they listed SWAPO in Namibia. They listed MPLA in Angola. They listed Frelimo in Mozambique. They listed the ANC in what's called South Africa. But that was subjective, because they were only focusing on the liberation movements with a Marxist-Leninist lean in. How can they say that the Convention People's Party, led by Osagyefo for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, was not authentic? How can they say the Democratic Party of Guinea, led by Ahmed Sekou Touré, was not authentic? How could they say that the PA's Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania was not authentic? How could they say that EPLF, that for the 30-year guerrilla struggle in Eritrea, was not authentic? So the misunderstanding and confusion about Zimbabwe those on the left are guilty of that, some based on subjectivity, based on paternalism. And of course, we know on the right, we don't expect them to have the final word on our history. Our work in particular starts in 2002. What inspired us to get into the work is we're the babies of the anti-apartheid movement in what's called South Africa, ZANU, as the people call it. And we were living in Washington, D.C. We had a chance to work with the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania political exiles, the Black Consciousness Movement of Azania/Azapo political exiles, and the ANC political exiles. We work with all three in D.C., in the D.C. and the New York area. So we realized that when you take a look at the chronology, Mozambique gets its independence in 1974-75, them and Angola do. Zimbabwe gets its independence in 1980. Namibia gets its independence in 1990, overshadowed by the release of Madiba Nelson Mandela. And what's called South Africa gets its independence in 1994. So we realized that if we were going to be true to a Pan-African focus, we had to take a look at what we could do for those other countries who were independent, because Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah taught us that defending liberated zones and liberated territory even takes precedence over assisting liberation movements on the quest for power, on the verge of seizing power. So we realized that history obligated us to work with ZANU-PF, work with Frelimo, work with SWAPO, work with MPLA in whatever way we can. So then at the time, they were going through their 2002 presidential election. So, and of course, the land reclamation program was launched 2 years before that. And 3 years before that, what the land reclamation program overshadows is something that they did in conjunction with Angola and Namibia, where each year the Southern African Development Community has an umbrella. That's the umbrella for the 14 nations in Southern Africa. So each country gets a chance to chair that body, and another country gets to oversee the militaries, their defense forces. So it was Zimbabwe's turn in 1999 to oversee Southern Africa's defense forces. And at the time, the Democratic Republic of the Congo had joined the Southern African Development Community and become a full-fledged member. And at that particular point, Ambassador Susan Rice was then the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under Madeleine Albright, the first woman to be a Secretary of State in the United States, in U.S. history. And her pet project, her coming out party, if you will, was to re-invade the Congo, to reestablish the network of Mobutu Sese Seko after he had been overthrown after nearly 40 years in power. So the United States, in conjunction with Uganda and Burundi, were going to try to carry this effort out. But Zimbabwe's military, Angola's military, and Namibia's military were able to defend the Congo and prevent the invasion from happening. So that angered the United States and the European Union very much. That initiative was called Operation Sovereign Legitimacy. And then the following year, they embarked on their land reclamation program, their historic land reclamation program. It was historic for a multitude of reasons. If you go back to February 24th, 1966, and you look at the overthrow of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, you know that he was outside of the country en route to Vietnam to present a plan to end the Vietnam War, because the Osagyefo felt a sense of solidarity to Vietnam, because Vietnam's defeat of French colonialism and imperialism made it possible for Lumumba and the Congolese national movement to be free, for Sékou Touré and the PDG to be free, for Modibo Keïta and the people of Mali to be free, and for the people, Ahmed Ben Bella and the FLN in Algeria to be free from French colonialism. So because of that, because of the impact of the Vietnamese Revolution and how Africa benefited from it, he felt the favor should be returned. So what happened was he was out of the country. Of course, Lyndon Johnson, the Johnson administration, in conjunction with British intelligence, executed a coup d'etat. And the current president of Ghana, Akufo-Addo, the darling of the West, his uncle was involved in that coup d'etat against Nkrumah. When the land reclamation program in Zimbabwe started, President Mugabe was out of the country in Cuba at the G77 summit. And he was brought to his attention that the war veterans had started the process. They started the process because at the end of the armed struggle that lasted for 14 years, where Zimbabwe's two liberation movements, ZANU and ZAPU, defeated the two most powerful colonial armies ever assembled in Africa, the second most powerful. They sat down in Lancaster House in London, and it was decided that between 1980 and 1990, $5 billion would be put up by the US government and British government to help the British and Rhodesians either locate to a regular home in Zimbabwe or an apartment or a house. They would no longer own a land half the size of one of the 10 provinces that they were in. Those days were over. Or they could relocate back to England. And so the agreement was signed. The Reagan administration comes in, and they said they would not honor the agreement because they were not guarantors of it. Thatcher honored it. John Major honored it. But then by the time the cheap carbon copy of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, comes on the scene, he lets it be known with his foreign secretary, Claire Short, who ironically is of Irish ancestry, when you know the history of British occupation of Ireland. And she said they came out and said they would pursue regime change. And in 1999, the same time that the Operation Sovereign Legitimacy was being carried out by Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy put up money, a British and United States foundation, to start the movement for democratic change, to try to bring about regime change in Zimbabwe. After watching what they did in Zambia with the movement for multi-party democracy, which disposed of UNIP in Zambia, which brought about the independence of Zambia under the leadership of the recently passed Pan-African trailblazer, Kenneth Kaunda, His Excellency. So this is what Zimbabwe was dealing with. So we were working with them on that election. We worked with them on the 2005 parliamentary election. We worked with them during their 2008 presidential election, their 2013 presidential election. Like you said, we've written over 400 articles about in the paper. We've written 3 children's plays, one about Sally Mugabe, President Mugabe's first wife, the Ghanaian woman who accepted the dictum of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it's linked to the independence of the African continent. And so she leaves Ghana, a free nation, 3 years into their independence, and goes into Southern Rhodesia and organizes with the women of ZANU and the comrades in ZAPU who were fighting for independence. We did a play about her. We did a play about the lead guerrilla of the armed struggle, Josiah Mangama Tongogara, who died in a car crash on December 26, 1979. And even though he did more than anyone to liberate Zimbabwe on the battlefield, he also was a Frelimo guerrilla. He also was a member of UNIP in Zambia, so his presence was felt all around the region. He did not live to see the Zimbabwean flag go up and the British flag go down, so we did a children's play about him. And then we did another play about the Heroes' Acre, where all the heroes of the revolution are buried. So, and as you mentioned, the Battle Cry for Cuba and Zimbabwe project, that's a project we worked on with Mutulu Olubala, affectionately known as M1 of the internationally acclaimed hip-hop group Dead Prez. We did 3 albums between the end of 2013 and 2016, 100 songs of multi-genre, cross-generational. And the songs were calling for the lifting of the blockade on Cuba and the lifting of sanctions on Zimbabwe. So we did that. So 3 plays, 3 albums, 400 articles. We did an appeal exposing the HIV/AIDS issue in Zimbabwe, because even though Southern Africa is the most crippled region by the deadly HIV/AIDS pandemic, the genocidal HIV/AIDS pandemic, Zimbabwe has had more breakthroughs in the fight against AIDS than any other nation in Southern Africa. Yet, because of their stance on the land reclamation program, the former U.S. Secretary of Health, Tommy Thompson, and his British counterpart, Richard Feacham, they conspired in their leadership of Global Fund to deny Zimbabwe's applications 4 rounds, the 2nd round, 3rd round, 4th round, 6th round. And the former director of UNICEF, Carol Bellamy, a Caucasian, came out and said that this was persecution of the poor. So we figured that this was something that we could do to bring attention to the question. And then we did an appeal to the Obama administration, because even before President Obama came into office in the White House, when he was the lowest ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2006, he had written a letter to President Bush saying, don't lift the sanctions on Zimbabwe until the dark cloud of Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF have been ousted from power. And he was taking his lead from the Congressional Black Caucus, because when the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act was initiated and introduced as the sanctions, as they're known, in 2001, which was a vindictive measure in response to the land reclamation program, the Black Caucus came 5 votes short of voting unanimously in favor of the sanctions. The only 5 that did not vote against the sanctions, Cynthia McKinney of Georgia, Corrin Brown of Florida, Stephanie Tubbs Jones of Ohio, Carolyn Kilpatrick of Michigan, and Bobby Rush of Illinois, the second recruit of the Black Panther Party after Fred Hampton, they abstained. So not one member of the Congressional Black Caucus voted against those sanctions. To put this in the U.S. context for people, in the Senate, it was pushed through by Hillary Rodham Clinton, then a senator in New York, Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, and a senator named Joseph Biden, in case the name sounds familiar. A white liberal congressman who says he's socialist out of Vermont named Bernie Sanders voted in favor of those sanctions.
Wow.
Colin Powell, Secretary of State, pushed him through, and Bush, and Donald Payne, the late Donald Payne of the Congressional Black Caucus, who was considered the appoint man on Africa, supposedly the most knowledgeable. He was the one with his Republican counterpart in New Jersey, Christopher Smith, who pushed it through Congress. And what makes it very interesting is when the Reagan administration in 1980 came out and said that they weren't going to honor the Lancaster House negotiations, the Black Caucus did nothing to pressure the Reagan administration, the Bush administration after that one, the Clinton administration after that one, Bush the son. They never pressured the U.S. government to honor the Lancaster House agreements. So to add insult to injury, now they vote in favor of sanctions against the Zimbabwean people aimed at stifling them. The impact those sanctions had, Zimbabwe has a 97% literacy rate, but it began to impact the school system, pay for teachers, resources for the schools, things of that nature. Zimbabwe once had the best roads in all of Africa. Now the joke in Zimbabwe is you can tell someone's driving drunk if they're driving in a straight line, because you have to weave the potholes in Harare and Bulawayo, the 2 main cities. Zimbabwe, like we said, had the best, one of the best healthcare systems in Africa. They had the #1 cholera tracking system in Southern Africa, the #1 net rollout program to prevent children from getting malaria before the sanctions. So this shows you the impact of sanctioning on them. And so the Bush administration introduced those sanctions in 2001. The Obama administration for 8 years maintained the sanctions. The Trump administration maintained the sanctions. And you know what Mr. Biden is going to do, since he's a co-sponsor of the sanctions. So, and it goes back to what President Obama said during his first inauguration speech. He said, the might of our military must be matched by the strength of our diplomacy. So what that means is, even though their preference is to assassinate a leader who won't capitulate and bow down, even though they prefer to bomb countries like the Ku Klux Klan burns crosses, if they have to starve children to death to make their point, to make their presence felt, starve women to death to make their presence felt, starve men to death to make their presence felt, destroy schools and destroy hospitals to make their presence felt, they have no problem doing that at all.
Well said, man. And it's so understated how important it is to emphasize the damage that sanctions do on a nation, on all of the nations that are sanctioned: Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, Nicaragua, DPRK. All of these nations have been impacted by sanctions in a way that completely devastates Black, brown, working class families, unable to feed their children, unable to go to school. And it's part of the combined hybrid warfare of media and economic sanctions, because what they can do is that they can leverage these sanctions, impose it on nations, building up their sovereignty, and then blame the problems created by sanctions to begin with on the systems of those governments.
You're exactly right. That's why whenever you're fighting sanctions imposed on our comrades, it's very important for us to know about the positive attributes of that country. So before they start saying that human rights and the lack of democracy. And what's so interesting about that is we want to talk about Zimbabwe just in the scheme of the African continent's needs. If you look at any African Union meeting, all the documents, all the high-level discussions they have, you know that the main theme is agriculture and food security. The land reclamation program in Zimbabwe is the reason for that. The imperialists used to say that only President Mugabe and ZANU-PF cronies were the only beneficiaries of that land program. 350,000 families in a nation where the average family consists of 6 people. Many of the women's, or they had these civil society groups, which we'll talk about later. And you would see groups like Women of Zimbabwe Arise that are on the payroll of the National Democratic Institute. And we were saying 68% of the farming in Zimbabwe is done by women. No other nation on earth where agriculture is the staple of the economy, where agriculture is the staple of the culture, can make that claim. This is happening at a moment, Ramiro, that 67% of the workforce in Southern Africa, their work is agro-based. So Zimbabwe's ability to maintain itself and flourish agriculturally benefits the whole region and inspires the whole region. And the other reason they were very upset is because they know that Namibia wanted to deal with the land question after their independence. As much recognition as Nelson Mandela gets, they've been more Nelson Mandela movies than Planet of the Apes movies and Batman movies and Superman movies in the last 20 years. I challenge anyone to go to any Mandela speech they can find and see him speaking about land. And 83% of the land in what's called South Africa is still in the hands of those who controlled it during apartheid.
Yep.
So and since the only thing that separates Zimbabwe and South Africa is the Limpopo River, it automatically magnified that contradiction. So the interesting thing is the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus voted in favor of sanctions on Zimbabwe, and Colin Powell was the one who pushed it through as the Secretary of State. If you read Colin Powell's autobiography, he flew with the Black Caucus on a plane. They flew together to Mandela's inauguration. And Ron Dellums, the former chair of the Armed Services Committee, told him that if he switched parties, they would run him for president. So it shows that they were so the agenda to bring about regime change in Zimbabwe was certainly bipartisan. When we talk about corporations, that cannot be ignored, because as we speak right now, there are 3 corporations that are complicit with the regime change agenda for Zimbabwe. The first one is Virgin Airlines. Sir Richard Branson openly finances MDC. Sir Richard Branson put up $36 million to start a think tank called the Elders Group. Madiba Nelson Mandela belonged to it. Desmond Tutu belonged to it. Jimmy Carter belonged to it. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, belonged to it. And then then Peter Gabriel, the rock singer, raised another $36 million for them by doing some concerts. Their first project was to try to force their way into Zimbabwe. But Sir Richard Branson wants to take over the tourism industry in Zimbabwe. That's his interest. Back when they were negotiating during the Lancaster House negotiations, Jesse Helms made arrangements to take a Zimbabwean priest named Abel Muzariwa, who was the agent of the Rhodesians during the liberation struggle, who was trying to upstage ZANU-PF and ZAPU. And they brought him to Washington. He had a private meeting with the leadership of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation and the Philip Morris Tobacco Corporation. And they told him that if he would relinquish control of the tobacco industry to their corporations, they would help him ascend to the leadership of Zimbabwe over Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo.
Wow. It's crazy.
So these are the things that people may not know or may not even care about. But the thing about it is Zimbabwe is going to remain a high priority, because when you look at the agricultural dynamic, even if people are looking at gentrification and property rights in the US, that would resonate with them. You're going after a country with a 97% literacy rate at a time where all of the historical Black colleges and universities are struggling to keep their doors open. At a moment in history where 1.7 million children drop out of school in the United States every year, 7,000 children drop out a day, and you're going to try to destroy a country that has a 97% literacy rate? We mentioned the agricultural dynamic. We mentioned their health attributes. Let's do women. If you go back and look at when President Mugabe, after the death of one of his closest friends and one of the true pioneers in his struggle, the great Simon Muzenda, transitioned to the ancestors, he was vice president. He gave his position, he appointed Amai Joyce Mujuru, who he fell out with later, but let me make the main point. She was the highest ranking woman guerrilla fighter during their 14-year armed struggle. And if you go back and look at when she became the first woman vice president in modern Africa, it paved the way for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to preside over Liberia, for Joyce Banda to preside over Liberia, for Catherine Samba Panza to be the interim president in the Central African Republic, for Ethiopia today to have a woman president. But Zimbabwe doesn't take credit for it. And President Mugabe proposed to the Southern African development community that women should be 51% of the parliament. But these are things that when in the scheme of everything that goes on, people either conveniently ignore, but they're used to that. For example, as much as we love Cuba, and we love Cuba, everybody talks about Cuba fighting for 14 years in Angola at Cuito Cuineavle, do they not?
Right. Right
next door in Mozambique, where Zimbabwe carried out their armed struggle, that's where their main guerrilla station was. They had 3 outlets. They had support in Tanzania and Zambia, but ZANU's main camp was in Mozambique. And as soon as they went back to Zimbabwe to resettle and get used to being an independent people, Samora Machel called on his comrade and said, man, Renamo is strong and the CIA is backing them. Portuguese intelligence is backing them. We need you. And without hesitating, President Mugabe sent 50,000 troops back into Mozambique to fight off Renamo. That is just as important as stabilizing Southern Africa. And for many people who claim to be on the left, who we know are born again social democrats now, and this is the reason they're against Zimbabwe. They know this because one of the main ones was the great Bayard Rustin, who we admire. And Bayard Rustin, when he became a born-again social democrat, he supported Zionist Israel and wrote Golda Meir a letter of praise, supporting how she was handling Arab terrorists. And he supported UNITA against MPLA. And he said the reason is we must stop the rise of Cuba's influence in the southern region of Africa. Zimbabwe going into Mozambique is just as important as Cuba going into Angola, if we're going to be honest. Back to the Marxist-Leninist dynamic. Many people used to call Comandante Fidel Castro, that great champion of humanity, a pawn of the Soviets. If that is the case, he didn't show it when it came to Africa. The first place he went in Africa was Guinea. So Ahmed Sékou Touré expelled the Soviet ambassador in 1961, saying you're supposed to be revolutionary, but you're just as paternalist as those you claim to be in diametrical opposition to. Let me show you the door. The first place Fidel went in Africa was Guinea. Only other person besides Jose Marti he called a revolutionary apostle is Ahmed Sékou Touré.
Wow.
Because of the Soviet connection, ZAPU was considered an authentic movement. ZANU was Chinese supported. Matter of fact, ZANU is the only non-Soviet liberation movement to take power in Southern Africa. SWAPO in Namibia was Soviet supported. MPLA in Angola was Soviet supported. ANC in South Africa was Soviet supported. Frelimo in Mozambique was Soviet supported. ZANU was supported by the Chinese. And we joke when we talk about Cuban solidarity history, we say when it comes to Africa, there's a Marxist-Leninist interpretation of Cuban African solidarity, and then there's another interpretation. The Marxist-Leninist interpretation shows Mandela next to Fidel with the Marti Award, which suggests he's the first one to get it. He's the third head of state. Thomas Sankara got it in 1984, the mighty Thomas Sankara out of Burkina Faso. In 1985, Robert Mugabe got it. And the Soviets didn't like him getting it, but Fidel gave it to him anyway. And if the Soviets are honest, they didn't want Cuba to go to Angola and fight. They did it anyway. And the reason that Zimbabwe has a 97% literacy rate is because between 1986 and 1996, 3,000 Zimbabwean teachers went to Cuba for training at the Isle of Youth. So there are all these layers to this history, and this is what they don't want you to know about. In terms of the armed struggle, in terms of the armed struggle piece, this is the other interesting thing. If you know the history of Fort Hare University, where Mugabe went, where Mandela went, where the first leader of ZANU, Herbert Chitepo, the first African to practice law in Tanzania, went, where Mangalizo Sobukwe, who was considered the most dangerous freedom fighter in what's called South Africa, went, the only one to be in solitary confinement on Robben Island. They all studied Gandhi, overkill. And to Nyerere of Tanzania, the great Nyerere, he was there too. So to know that these Africans who were reading Gandhi like Christians read the Bible or Muslims read the Quran, just taking it in, that when they came of age, all of them, except in South Africa, liberated themselves by arms. So, which is why we say that Malcolm was correct when he said by any means necessary. If we can have revolution by positive action, like Nkrumah did in Guinea, or Sekou Touré did Nkrumah did in Ghana, Sekou Touré did in Guinea, Lumumba did in the Congo, or Gaddafi did in Libya, we'll do that. But if we got to take up arms like we did in Eritrea, like we did in Zimbabwe, like we did in Namibia, like we did in Angola, we will do that. We will do that. So Zimbabwe is a reinforcement of that story. One of the greatest highlights of my 31 years of service was having a 1-hour meeting with President Mugabe in 2003 when he was at the United Nations General Assembly. His ambassador at the time, Simbi Mubako, who we owe everything for opening up Zimbabwe to us, when we met him, we brought him to Bowie State University. And then when we found out that he had latitude to travel over the country in the summer of between 2002 and 2003, we had organized travels for him with a network of people where he got to go to Chicago, he got to go to Gary, Indiana, he got to go to Norfolk, Virginia, he got to go to California, he got to go to Philadelphia, he got to go to Alabama, he got to go to Georgia. And so when he gave President Mugabe his briefing, President Mugabe was like, who's moving you around like that? We have that type of support. We haven't moved around like that since we were a liberation movement. And so he mentioned us. At the time, I was in an organization called the Pan-African Liberation Organization. He was like, they must be young. He said, yeah, they're in their 30s. They're young. And he said, bring them to me. And they told us to come to New York. And we jumped on that 6 a.m. train that Monday. We go and see him. We sit down with him. And I remember Kwame Ture telling me what it was like to be in Ho Chi Minh's company when SNCC went to Hanoi. And that's the closest experience I have to it. And he just started talking, and he just came out and he said, hey, we don't judge our sisters and brothers in the States and the diaspora, but we do have a word of caution for them. They need to stop taking such a romantic and adventurous approach to analyzing developments in Africa. They pay too much attention to coups, but they pay very little attention to the dynamics of isolation that make a country vulnerable to a coup. If they can make that quantum leap in their thinking and understanding, they can change US, EU, Africa policy instantly. And they should accept the challenge to do that. And he was saying that the miscalculation that the West has made is with the leadership of the frontline states resigning, Chissano stepping down in Mozambique, and Nkapa stepping down in Tanzania, Mandela stepping down in South Africa, Zania, Kaunda stepping down, losing an election in Zambia. He said they think that this new brand of leadership are moderate in comparison to the elders, and they're going to turn on Zimbabwe. And he said, how wrong they are, but we're going to enjoy watching them make a fool of themselves. He was correct. When I went to Zimbabwe the first time in 2006, the president of Malawi at the time, Mutharika, the EU was there doing a refurbishing project of their roads. They had the worst roads in Southern Africa at the time. And he just came out and said, we're going to have a celebration here for the main road of the country. It's going to be named in honor of Robert Mugabe. And the EU called that man into the office like he was a waiter that got the wrong order and said, hey, if you invite him, we'll pull out right now. Like de Gaulle pulled out of Guinea when they said no to his referendum. And he said, you better rethink. And Mutharika said, hey, you don't know African tradition. You cannot disinvite a guest once you've invited them. You can only disinvite those who invited themselves, if you get what I'm saying. What they didn't know, brother, is that President Mugabe is part Malawian. His father's from Malawi. His mother's from Zimbabwe. And he's loved just as much in Malawi as he was loved in Zimbabwe. That's what they mean when they say Bush said it, Obama said it, Trump said it, and Biden is saying it. Small country, but it presents a rather peculiar problem for our interest. What are they talking about? They're talking about the power of linguistics. It is no secret that we are proud as African people to be the most linguistically diverse people the earth has ever known. We've created 5,000 languages since the beginning of time that have been confirmed. That's not dialects, that's not lingo, that's not forked tongue, but languages. But we communicate to the world primarily in our 7 colonial languages: English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, German, Arabic, and Italian. But the way President Mugabe could articulate Zimbabwe's challenges and history and narrative in English was a problem for them. So that was one of the reasons that a specific aspect of the sanctions was he couldn't come 25 kilometers outside of Manhattan. Because imagine if he got to come to DC. Imagine if he got to come to Philly. Imagine if he got to come to California and talk to the people, or people who were offended that the Bush administration said that reparations shouldn't have been on the agenda at the United Nations Conference on Racism, Xenophobia, and Other Related Tolerances, of people tired of gentrification, of people who are only 12% of the U.S. population, but 45% of the homeless. You think what he was saying wouldn't resonate with them? What if he came and said, all the homeless sisters and brothers, stand up. We got farmland for you. And ask Prairie View in Houston, Florida A&M in Tallahassee, Tuskegee, the house that Booker T. Washington built, Alabama A&M, to give them basic training, and then ask them what you want, land in Africa or a park bench in the United States. So think about the things. Think about the impact that HIV/AIDS has in our community, and our people will learn that Zimbabwe was being denied resources to deal with the problem. Think about that. So this is the fear that they have, and it's the fear that they continue to have. And Zimbabwe has made another quantum leap intellectually, strategically. The great Tichona Jaconia, Ambassador Tichona Jaconia, who was their ambassador to Geneva, the ambassador to the UN in New York, and then he became the Minister of Information and Publicity, now called the Ministry of Media, Information and Broadcasting Services. He said information is the first line of defense for us, which echoes the sentiments of Comandante Fidel Castro at the Organization of Caribbean and Latin American Youth in 2000, when he said the 21st century is a war of ideas. So Zimbabwe is saying, even so, we beat you in an arms struggle, but now we're going to win the propaganda war against you. And a few years ago, I was told to go to truly uncharted territory, the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is the most powerful think tank in this country, that dictates to the State Department what foreign policy should be, that dictates to Congress and the Senate and the White House what should be done. They were bringing in an expert on Africa from Chatham House in Britain, Dr. Alex Vines. And Johnny Carson, the former U.S. Secretary for African Affairs under Obama's first administration, and was the U.S. ambassador to Zimbabwe under Clinton, and is the highest ranking African to serve on the Strategic Defense Command, which is a component of the CIA that gives them tactical direction. This is the type of person you have to deal with. And he said that we have to admit that Zimbabwe is winning the propaganda war against us, not necessarily because of their media, but a group of ragtag journalists in the diaspora who have helped spread their message. And people turn around and look at me because I'm the U.S. correspondent to the Herald, and that's an interesting story. I'm Nigerian. If you know Zimbabwe's history, like I said, when they first gained their independence, they had to take control of the economy and locate the currency, where it was being hidden, things of that nature. And Nigeria gave them $20 million to purchase the national newspaper back from some Boers in South Africa who owned it. Once again, Madiba Nelson Mandela did not take control of what's called South Africa's media. They don't control their media. They don't control their military. They don't control their land. So in Zimbabwe, they went for the media and they control it. So even though and another beautiful part of that story is you've heard the Bush administration, Obama administration, Trump administration, and Biden administration say that Zimbabwe, there's persecution of media. There's a paper in Zimbabwe called The Zimbabwean, where the family that runs that paper were informants for the British and Rhodesian intelligence services during the liberation struggle, and they're allowed to have a paper. There's a paper ran by someone who lives in South Africa called the Mail and Guardian. That doesn't even live in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwean people, when you see them coming down the street, they're reading every newspaper in the country. They're reading the Financial Gazette. They're reading the Zimbabwe Independent. They're reading the Zimbabwean. They're reading all these papers. They saved the Herald for last. And I never saw police and military on the corners dictating to people to buy the paper. And then we ask them every time they say that, you supported Houphouët-Boigny, the most ruthless neo-colonialist in African history in Cote d'Ivoire. How many newspapers existed in Cote d'Ivoire during his nearly 40 years in power? How many newspapers existed with their man Omar Bongo in Gabon? How many newspapers existed in Mobutu's Congo? How many newspapers existed in Bukasa's Central African Republic? Since they want to talk about objective press and inclusive press.
Right.
So
the double standard is crazy.
Yeah. And matter of fact, something almost happened, but we knew that it wasn't. Some people try to set it up. Bill Clinton's favorite journalist, Nicholas Kristof, that writes for the New York Times. You grew up in New York, so you probably know what I'm talking about.
Of course.
He snuck into Zimbabwe about 12, 13 years ago. He didn't even show his journalist credentials. He went as a tourist. So he started sneaking around interviewing people. And he says, I talked to someone that said they long for the days of Rhodesia.
Wow.
And I was like, how racist can the liberal be? So when Dr. King told us in the letter from the Birmingham jail, he ain't tripping off the Klan or the White Citizens Council. The white moderate and their paternalism scares him more. When Malcolm called that Democrat a fox, I'm like, this is what they're talking about. When Kwame Ture talked about the pitfalls of the white liberal, you are saying that you met a Zimbabwean that wished that Rhodesia was still there. Are you telling me if you had a time machine, you couldn't have went back on a plantation and found someone that would have told you that they would help the plantation owner catch Harriet Tubman? You couldn't have went to the South and found someone that was supposed to be in a church informing the sheriff in Montgomery about the plans of the Montgomery bus boycott? You couldn't have went to Kenya and talked to someone that fought with the King's African Rifles instead of against the Mau Mau to maintain British colonialism? You couldn't go to Palestine and find an agent for the Mossad telling you about the PLO and Hamas? Who you think you're dealing with? How stupid do you think we are? So this is what I'm saying. So these are the things, brother, that we've had to deal with. But it's been an eye opener. It's been extremely humbling. But it's let me know how strong we are and how hungry our people are to build these ties and maintain these ties. You know the reason that M1 and I got together to do the music project? Let me tell you. In 2005, one of my favorite artists, and probably one of yours, Nas on the album he did with Damian Marley?
Yeah.
Track 11, Road to Zion.
Mm.
President Mugabe is turning guns on the people of Zimbabwe, doing things that'll make the Pope seem godly. Yeah, but understand the strategy of that. You do that, you're persuaded to do that on the son of Bob Marley's album. If you go to the Bob Marley Museum in Kingston, there's a whole wall about his trip on Zimbabwe. I don't think, and Damien wasn't born when Bob died. His mother was still expecting him. How do you think they've sat down with him and talked to him about that experience? Do you think it's a coincidence that the Marley family have not been allowed by their handlers to go back to Zimbabwe and perform? To defend the land reclamation program? Do you know how many artists go to South Africa and skip Zimbabwe? Lauryn Hill was supposed to perform in Zimbabwe and pulled out. John Legend was supposed to perform in Zimbabwe and pulled out. This is why we say if we have our way, we'll turn people who say they're woke into insomniacs, and they better be ready. So Brother M, when we talked to him, he said, man, I'm glad I could help. He said, yeah, because I'm watching this and it just doesn't sit right with me. And I said, you know what? Let's just do a song. So we were thinking of like some We Are the World type of stuff. So he gets on the radio with us. Now we're going to do a project and we call it Artists from Everywhere, and it's going to be a movement. We can't just do a song. And early in the interview, I had used the Sekou Touré quote: to be part of the African Revolution, it's not enough to write a revolutionary song. You must write the songs with the people, and the songs will come up themselves and by themselves. And I say, man, you set me up, because I knew I would have to do a lot of the organizing. But because he put his name to that, I'll be eternally grateful to him. And we got 100 songs of music, multi-genre, cross-generational. Battle Cry Cuba Zim.wordpress.com is how you can get the music. It's not for sale, it's free, it's yours. And go back, man, we got the #1 hip-hop group in Venezuela, B2Aya, who claims Yoruba. They're on it. One of the Last Poets is on it. One of, for you R&B enthusiasts, one of the original lead singers of The Moments is on there. Man, it's jazz on there, gospel, hip hop, you name it. And we had the honor of doing a concert around the International Committee to Free the Cuba 5. So people got a chance to see about 25 of the acts in one night. So
I put the website on the chat, by the way,
man, I see that. I appreciate that. Remember, so yeah, so people can listen to that. So this is what we're saying. So for those who want to go around lecturing on giving these critiques of hip hop and critiques of popular culture, but don't want to work with artists, you're trying to build a brand. You ain't trying to build no movement.
Of course,
don't think people could see through the masquerade. Think again. So we were happy, man, and for him to step up and I mean, Lupe Fiasco attacked Zimbabwe. People we love. And we went to Chicago with Roy Ajimong to show the movie to Chicago State University. And Lupe Fiasco's in-laws were there. And they said, man, we got to put you in touch with him because he needed to be here because he don't get it. And we said, hey, it's not his fault, though. So we weren't trying to attack our sisters, attack our brothers. We just was like, look. And the beautiful thing is you also saw an evolution in the enemy strategy. Now, when it comes to Cuba, they say, oh, you can't go. We forbid you. When it came to Zimbabwe, they say, oh, you shouldn't go. For years, the State Department had on their emergency broadcast, non-essential visits to Zimbabwe for U.S. citizens should be deferred due to political violence. Had fun with that one, too. Now, look here. The second time I went to Zimbabwe, I'm going on South African Airways. The flight, one of the stewardesses said, "You're going to Zimbabwe?" I said, "You're not scared?" I said, "No, I lived there for 6 months." She said, "When?" I said, "Just recently. I'm going back." And she said, "Oh, when we go there, they tell us not to come out our hotel rooms." I'm saying, "Why not?" "Oh, it's dangerous." Then I looked at her. I said, where you live? Where you from? I'm from South Africa. I said, I figured that way. I live in Johannesburg. I said, 36 people a day get shot in Johannesburg.
Right.
Johannesburg makes Chicago look like a Sunday church service. And you're not scared there. She said, oh, well, we know what to expect there. I said, 36 people a year don't get shot in Zimbabwe. A few years later, when I went back to take my father's ashes, the Jehovah Witnesses were having their convention there.
Oh,
and
God.
I went to see a sister who hosted me my first time there. I stayed in her lodge. She took great care of me. And in African tradition, you know, we always go to show our gratitude. So she says, you should talk to them. And they say, we hear your accent. Are you part of our delegation? I said, no. They said, what are you doing here? I said, I work here. They said, what do you do? I said, I'm a journalist. Oh, we can't talk to the media. I said, I'm not trying to talk to you. I know what you tell me. They said, what would we say? I said, this is the most peaceful place you've ever been in your life, and they told you not to come here. How do you know? I said, I hear it all the time. Then a woman says, hey, I left my purse in this store with my passport, my money, and this 7-year-old boy that was there helping his mother ran me 2 blocks down the street with my purse and wouldn't even take no money from me. And I said, the Australian cricket team came to play in Zimbabwe. Didn't even want to take a shower after the game. Said, we're going straight to South Africa.
Wow.
We were told not to even stay here the night. And the next time they saw them, they were face down in the nude in a sports bar in South Africa. They got robbed. That would have never happened in Zimbabwe. And the joke is, there are 2 jokes that now Mnangagwa, but then especially President Mugabe, should come and be president for a week in South Africa and take the land. And Zimbabwe's police should come to South Africa to bring about peace amongst the people and go home. That's how much it's respected. So when you go and look at the hearings on www.thomas.gov that these people have, and they talk about restructuring the military and the police, it's because they can't control them. And one of the goals of AFRICOM is to discredit our legitimate fighting forces. But as you mentioned earlier, Zimbabwe, we joke and say Palestinian work is addition. Cuban work and Venezuelan work is algebra. Zimbabwe work is calculus and trigonometry. Because Zimbabwe gets attacked on the left and the right.
Right. Yep.
Right now, there's an organization, I won't say who, but they put out a statement a few years ago, completely false, that Zimbabwe's purchased weapons from AFRICOM. And they use some bogus website to prove their point. How could Zimbabwe be under sanctions? Every member of Congress in the International Relations Committee, every member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that has something negative to say about Zimbabwe has said that their military must be completely restructured, and they're going to sell them weapons. Really? And man, we had to go against Trans-Africa, not just to buy a caucus.
Right.
We found out that Trans-Africa was funneling National Endowment for Democracy money to 14 civil society groups in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has more civil society groups than any country in Africa. They have 400. 350 of them are in the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. They're financed by the one and only George Soros.
Yep.
Daddy Warbucks in real life. Then 36 of them are financed by the National Democratic Institute and Madeleine Albright. And then the 14 are financed by the National Endowment for Democracy. And Trans-Africa, who is credited with starting the anti-apartheid movement in this country, which we know is completely inaccurate, because when Paul Robeson and Du Bois were working for the Council of African Affairs and corresponding with the ANC, Randall Robinson wasn't even born. When SNCC was going to jail in front of the South African consulate in New York, and Belafonte and Sidney Poitier were bailing them out, Trans-Africa wasn't even in existence yet. So we know that that is the watered down narrative of anti-apartheid work. And it's not even anti-apartheid work. It was African National Congress support work because they didn't deal with PAC and ZAPA. So with that being said, and then so I mean, Zimbabwe has been through it. I mean, and to know that they are Africans who are willing to go on record, an African organization that claims to be on the left and will falsify that information. And this same organization has ties to George Soros indirectly.
Yep.
That's what's so interesting about it.
And it forms part of that strategy of like attacking the left from the left. And the thing
about it is on the international front, what President Mugabe had happened. So he got that Marti Award, so that's established. But then at the height of Comandante Hugo Chávez's popularity, we miss him so much, but we love Maduro just as much. He gives President Mugabe the Bolivar Award, patterned after the Marti Award, and it's a sword. And he said, like Bolivar had a sword, you have a sword. And what that did when President Mugabe showed up in Venezuela. Oh, what that did. And then when, of course, them having the relationship with China going way back to when ZANU sent guerrillas to the Nanking Academy in Peking, where they learned a valuable lesson about guerrilla warfare. You don't brandish weapons unless you're carrying out a preemptive strike. You spend the rest of your time educating your people about why the guerrilla war must be waged. Where the Russians who were working with them earlier said weaponry would determine the outcome of war. So the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, was one of those young people who went to Nanking. And so what ends up happening is, they started Look East policy dealing with China. And the State Department calls an emergency meeting about that because it was on the 25th anniversary of independence. Zimbabwe's victory at the United Nations has shook them up. The United States tried to use their influence at the UN to get Zimbabwe to accept something called LDC status, least developed country status. This is when you surrender your economy to outsiders. 37 of the 55 nations in Africa are doing that now. Zimbabwe said sanctions are the reason for our economic woes, not economic mismanagement. We're committed to our people. We represent homeland security, real homeland security, because we're indigenous. We ain't invaders. Thank you very much. So with that being said, so they fought that off. It was Zimbabwe's turn to chair in 2007, the Sustainable Development Committee at the UN. The US tried to block it, couldn't. In 2005, President Mugabe went to the UN Food and Agriculture Summit in Rome. The U.S. Ambassador Tony Hall tried to use leverage to prevent him from speaking. They said, Zimbabwe is a member of the UN. Step out of the way, sir, so the president can speak. Mm-hmm. So these are things that people may not know. Then the ultimate one of all was in 2008. The U.S. tried to get the UN Security Council to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. China and Russia vetoed that. So they realized that in the UN. And I remember in 2013 being with President Mugabe when he had just won the elections, and Barbara Lee is there, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And he says, those of you who should be fighting with us but want to work for our demise and interfere in our internal affairs, 3 words for you: shame, shame, shame. And she got up and walked out, embarrassed. So I mean, so these are things. And then in terms of what he had said to us about the African leaders in the neighborhood in SADC coming out against them, it was time when Gordon Brown first came to power for the EU-Africa summit in Portugal. And Gordon Brown said if President Mugabe came, he wasn't coming. Moana Sasa of Zambia sent him an emergency communique and said if President Mugabe doesn't come, none of us are coming. How you going to have a summit without Southern Africa, the richest part of Africa, present? Good luck with that. And he couldn't do it. Earlier in 2006, you had this summit, and they were saying that Kofi Annan was coming to Zimbabwe, and he was going to work out a resignation package for President Mugabe. He meets with him in Banjul in Gambia at a summit. And he calls a press conference and says, there's no international crisis in Zimbabwe. What you have is an unresolved bilateral dispute between a sovereign country and its former colonizer. Oh, they were angry. Oh, they were angry because they had said that Zimbabwe was using political clout and military muscle to force the opposition out of Harare during the parliamentary elections in 2005. And they did something called Operation Marambatrina, clean out the filth. And they sent a Tanzanian woman, Anatia Bajuka, from Switzerland in New York to observe the process. But before she came there, she had been on record in the UN saying that Zimbabwe had the most effective techniques to keep their urban centers clean. So what did she need to go for a fact-finding mission for something that she was celebrating?
Right.
And so a report came out that 500,000 people were homeless. It's only 1.5 million people in Harare. How could 500,000 people be homeless? So it got to the point where they were just making up things to create panic. And it's become more and more and more and more laughable. Then they cried like babies during President Mugabe's tenure. You don't let us come and observe your elections. So President Mnangagwa let the International Republican Institute put together a coalition. Johnny Carson, the former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under Bush, Constance Berry Newman, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, Catherine Samba Panza of the Central African Republic, and they went. The African Union said the elections were cool. SADC said the elections were cool. So they had to go along with it begrudgingly. But it was one of those things where even if we let you come, you're going to lie. And most importantly, and this is the thing about that, look, you come and observe our elections suggests that you feel that our approach to democracy is behind and primitive. Isn't that the implication? How many African women presidents and prime ministers have we had on that continent? I'm not saying we agree with them politically, but I'm saying that the culture is so sophisticated that the people are comfortable with them being at the helm of leadership. Right. And all you have is a glorified runner-up vice president to show. So who should be telling who about democracy? Who should give pointers to who? Africa or the West? So once you begin to pay attention to it, I mean, it's just one of those situations. Being an organizer in terms of work, y'all want work? Okay, cool. We got something for you. In February, we've been working on this for 14 years, and don't be disturbed. Dr. Du Bois in 1909 called for Encyclopedia Africana, and no HBCU or PWI in this country would put the resources up for that. And all he wanted to do was show Africa's contributions to anthropology, to literature, to math, to science, to engineering, to medicine. So in 1909, Nkrumah's born. In 1961, Nkrumah tells him he'll pay for that. That's where we brought him back to Ghana. So for 14 years, we've been trying to get universities in this country, high schools in this country, middle schools in this country, and other parts of the diaspora to work in partnership with not just Zimbabwe, but Southern African nations to create a timeline to show the parallels of our history in the diaspora and the history of Southern Africa, who's our baby, the last part of Africa to be free of settler colonialism. So, for example, if we say 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, creation of the National Medical Association, creation of the National Association of Colored Women. This is their 125th anniversary. Creation, Booker T. Washington gets George Washington Carver to come to Tuskegee from Iowa State. In that same year, Nehanda leads the first revolt of Zimbabweans against the British. So young people will learn that. So what happened in Lesotho? What happened in Malawi? What happened in Namibia? What happened in these places? And since we're going to include other parts of the diaspora, we want Cuba will be involved. Venezuela will be involved. Other parts of the Caribbean will be involved. This is going against the amputated narrative of the African experience. And when it comes to Africa, two notions must be smashed: that North Africa isn't part of Africa, and West Africa is the only part of Africa we give a damn about. Those are the two things. So by focusing on Southern Africa and East Africa now, that's how Pan-Africanism must be championed moving forward. So we're calling on all educators, that have connections to elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and universities. If you want to be part of that project, our brother knows how to get in touch with us. Our Twitter is at Junior J.R. Egbuna, Egbuna. Our email, obiegbuna15@gmail.com. We love you all to be involved in that. Instagram, I think it's at Obi Egbuna 15. I don't use it that much, but it's there. So I mean, that is something that, and we came up with that because when they had the cyclone 2 years ago, Zimbabwe was devastated, Malawi was devastated, and Mozambique was devastated. And the U.S. came out and said, help Mozambique as much as you can. Help Malawi as much as you can, but don't do anything with the Zimbabwe government. Do work with the civil society groups. So they wanted to put the opposition, who had no interest in the humanitarian welfare of the people, to try to exploit a humanitarian crisis to gain leverage in the struggle for dealing with regime change. So these are the trifling, disheartening, appalling things that our former colonizers have been up to. But we expect the worst from them, but we expect the best from us. So we got to stand up, we got to fight, we got to organize. And I like this part of it because we must go from articulating ideas to executing ideas. Everyone likes to articulate what they've learned. And when you go through the decolonization process, it's overwhelming and humbling at the same time, because you learn so much you didn't know. But with that being said, the moment you open your mouth about something, there's a responsibility that comes with it. So your hand should be out for labor. So for people who would like to work on that, and also through I'm the external relations officer of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. As we close, let me tell that story. The highest ranking Cuban diplomat, Cosme Torres Espinosa, to be deported from the United States for false charges of espionage in 2003. His next detail was to be the Cuban ambassador to Zimbabwe. And when I went there, we knew him from working in DC together. He recruited us into the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. And we mentioned the links, the link between the two countries. So what we did is we ended up getting this position. They gave it to us. It's a responsibility. We're the first external relations officer in the history of that organization. And it's about the people-to-people's relationship. And so what we want to do is begin to create a resource pool to support Cuba's medical efforts in not just Zimbabwe, but South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Eritrea, Liberia, and Guinea. But the initial push for this comes out of Zimbabwe. So if we're successful, Africa and Cuba will have Zimbabwe to thank. And Zimbabwe will do what they usually do. They'll humbly avoid the credit and just look for more challenges to take on, because that's the type of spirit that Robert Mugabe represented. That's the type of spirit that Herbert Chitepo represented, that Simon Muzenda represented, that Nehanda represented, that Joanna Nkomo represented, that Sally Mugabe represented, that so many great fighters that have been part of that struggle and given their life to that struggle, Nathan Chamurira represented. And we're just here to continue the work that they left behind and just let our people know that South Africa is just the tip of the iceberg. But that's a region in Africa that's preventing Africa from being neo-colonialist at the governmental level completely all the way around. And it is for that reason. If it wasn't for the Southern African nations, if it wasn't for what Ethiopia and Eritrea are doing with their peace process, you might as well put a United States flag and a British flag like a hood or a hoodie over the whole African continent. They're the only ones saving us from that humiliation, and they deserve our support for that reason. So we were glad, and like we said, we know the time is up. I'm sure it is, and we just hope that the little bit we shared tonight was what you were looking for from us.
Oh, we definitely, man. I gotta have you back on. I've learned more in this 1 hour than my whole college career, and I would definitely love to have you back on to talk about the history of colonization, because we know Zimbabwe has some of the most rarest valuable minerals and the platinum reserves. There's so much we can get into, right?
Yeah.
But what I want to do is before we head out,
real quickly before I leave, man. Wow, you they're the only country to be attacked for blood diamonds that weren't in a war, and they did this when they found out they had 25 of the world's diamond reserves. They've just found a rare form of methane gas. And one of the reasons, and the arms struggle was so important in that history, there's a place called Chinoy, and which has some of the rarest uranium reserves in the world. And Ian Smith had already had plans to dig it up and drain it all right when the arms struggle started. So the arms struggle interrupted more rape and more plunder. So, you know, when you get a chance to really look at the history for what it is and put it in the right context and understand why it deserves to be defended. And I'll close on this. It deserves to be defended, not validated. Validation is for parking. So if those external to our community don't feel Zimbabwe is worthy of defense, we're not looking for their approval. We're not looking for their validation. Our only humble appeal is don't try to sabotage what we do.
Beautifully said. Comrade Obi Egbuna Jr., revolutionary journalist and activist who serves as a U.S. correspondent to the Herald, Zimbabwe's national newspaper. Obi, definitely going to have you back on soon. I'm also going to, in the description, once this is done, I'm going to put some contact info for you. I'll check in with you first because I don't want to put your information out there like that. That way people can get in touch with you and get involved. Comrade Obi, thank you so much, brother. We'll talk soon. And take care, everybody. And we're going to go out with an inspirational speech from the revolutionary Mugabe. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
It is necessary that our minerals become truly ours. Unless we are there, and we are there as owners, we are there as shareholders, we will continue to be cheated. Zimbabwe is for Zimbabweans. It cannot be for the Americans. It cannot be for the British. Yes, we want to work with others. Yes, we want to be partners with others. If you want to be friends with us, fine. You stand there. And I stand here, we shake hands. Yes, we are friends. But remember, the gold in my country is mine. Defend Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe is yours.
In the days when our forefathers were alive, for the struggle, yes, struggle to survive.
We have shown you sacrifice for our heritage.
We're still struggling on, fighting.
For the people, ZANU is there as custodian and caretaker of the legacy. More blacks as partners can accompany a greater percentage of 51% or more should belong to Zimbabweans. 14 million people in the country. If they are together, then the world can never conquer. Brown, Blair, Bush, they say they are just blooming fools. Never being honest. Dishonesty, hypocrisy, that's the order of the day. In regard to visiting England, who wants to visit that miserable little country anyway? Your sanctions will, in future, demand reciprocation from us. And when we reciprocate, we will hit your businesses here.
Even though those days are gone, we're still struggling on.
We are tired of being workers. We must be owners also.